What if I told you that one of the world's favorite desserts was once responsible for one of the deadliest food disasters in history? It sounds impossible, but it's true. The story of ice cream is far more extraordinary than most people could ever imagine. It's a journey that spans thousands of years, crossing ancient empires, royal palaces, bustling marketplaces, scientific discoveries, and even a deadly epidemic that claimed more than 1,500 lives. Before we begin, if you enjoy learning English through fascinating true stories from history, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Every new subscriber helps this channel grow and encourages me to create more stories like this for you. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's begin. Chicago. Summer, 1858. The heat is unbearable. Horses collapse in the middle of the streets. The pavement grows soft beneath people's feet. The river is coated with green algae, and a terrible smell hangs over the entire city. People walk around with wet cloths pressed against their noses, hoping to block out the stench. In the middle of this suffocating summer, there is only one affordable escape: ice cream. It is sold on almost every street corner. It's cheap enough for nearly everyone to buy, and from sunrise to sunset, long lines of customers never seem to end. Children enjoy it on the sidewalks, while adults carry it home in small metal containers. Then, something terrifying begins to happen. People start getting sick. At first, it's only a handful of cases. Then dozens. Soon, hundreds. Doctors identify the illness as typhoid fever, a deadly disease that attacks the body's internal organs. Victims suffer from high fever, delirium, and internal bleeding. For many, death comes within weeks. By the end of the summer, more than 1,500 people have died in Chicago alone. City officials launch an urgent investigation, searching for the source of the epidemic. When they finally discover the cause, no one can believe it. The killer is the ice. Much of the city's ice had been cut from nearby lakes contaminated by raw sewage. Huge blocks were packed in sawdust, transported to factories, and used to make the very ice cream people depended on to survive the scorching heat. Every scoop carried an invisible danger. People thought they were cooling themselves down, but with every bite, they risked exposing themselves to a deadly disease. But this isn't where the story of ice cream begins. By 1858, ice cream had already existed for thousands of years. Its journey had taken it through the imperial palaces of China, the busy markets of the Arab world, the royal kitchens of Italy, and the elegant cafes of Paris before finally reaching the crowded streets of Chicago. So how did a frozen dessert travel halfway across the world and become one of humanity's favorite treats? To answer that question, we have to go back to the very beginning, back to snow, back to the mountains, and back to the first person who looked at a handful of ice and wondered, what if this could become dessert? Where did it all come from? Ask someone today who invented ice cream, and you'll probably hear the same answer: the Italians. Or maybe the French. Some people might even tell you the famous story of Catherine de' Medici, who supposedly brought the recipe from Florence to France when she married the future King Henry II in the 16th century. It's a wonderful story. There's just one problem. It almost certainly never happened. Historians have searched for evidence for decades, yet no reliable records from the 16th century mention anything like it. In fact, the legend doesn't appear in writing until the 20th century, almost 400 years after the events it claims to describe. We'll return to that mystery later, because the real story begins somewhere completely different, and nearly 1,000 years earlier. China. The Tang Dynasty, in the 7th century AD. Its ruler, Emperor Taizong, presided over one of the greatest golden ages in Chinese history. Trade flourished, art thrived, and the imperial court enjoyed luxuries that most people could scarcely imagine. Among the emperor's favorite treats were chilled desserts. According to records from the imperial court, enormous ice houses stored ice collected from the mountains during the winter months. Palace chefs mixed that ice with buffalo milk, flour, and camphor, an aromatic ingredient that created a refreshing cooling sensation. No one knows exactly what the dessert tasted like. Historians believe it was probably very different from the ice cream we know today. But the essential idea was already there. A sweet, milk-based mixture, served frozen. That simple concept would survive for centuries. Only the emperor and a small circle of nobles were allowed to enjoy it. The chefs who prepared it were sworn to secrecy, and revealing the recipe could bring severe punishment. From the very beginning, frozen desserts were never just food. They were symbols of wealth, power, and privilege. While the Chinese court guarded its frozen recipes behind palace walls, another tradition was quietly developing thousands of miles away, across the Silk Road, in the Arab world. By the 9th and 10th centuries, merchants in bustling marketplaces were selling sherbet, a refreshing mixture of fruit juice, snow, and sugar. The very word sherbet would eventually spread into many European languages. Snow was carefully transported from mountain peaks in insulated containers along well-organized trade routes. Before long, sherbet sellers had become a familiar sight throughout the great cities of the Middle East. Over time, this frozen tradition crossed the Mediterranean. Its first major stop was Sicily, an island that spent centuries under Arab influence.
There, the recipe slowly evolved into granita, a refreshing dessert made from crushed ice and fruit juice. Even today, granita is still enjoyed across Sicily, preserving many of the same ideas developed nearly 1,000 years ago. But Sicily wasn't the final destination. It was only the next step. From there, frozen desserts spread across mainland Europe. And this is where we arrive at one of the most famous and most misunderstood stories in the history of ice cream, the legend that never existed. If you've ever searched for the history of ice cream, you've probably heard the same story. It begins in the year 1533. A 14-year-old Italian noblewoman named Catherine de' Medici leaves Florence to marry the future king Henry II of France. According to the legend, she doesn't travel alone. She brings a team of Italian chefs with her, along with a secret recipe for frozen desserts, a delicacy the French had supposedly never tasted before. From there, the story follows a familiar path. The recipe is said to have remained a closely guarded secret inside the royal court, before slowly spreading across Europe and eventually becoming the ice cream we know today. It's a wonderful story. The only problem is, there is no evidence that it ever happened. Historians who specialize in the history of food have searched for centuries, but they have never found a single reliable source from the 16th century that mentions Catherine introducing ice cream to France. In fact, the story itself doesn't appear in print until the 20th century, almost 400 years after the events it claims to describe. In other words, one of the world's most famous ice cream stories is almost certainly a myth. The real history is much less dramatic, but far more interesting. Rather than being invented by one person or introduced by one queen, frozen desserts slowly spread through both Italy and France during the 17th century as trade expanded across the Mediterranean. There was no single inventor, no single country, and no single moment when ice cream was born. Instead, it evolved over generations. Still, one man deserves special credit for helping turn frozen desserts into a sensation. His name was Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli. In 1686, he opened Café Procope in Paris. More than 3 centuries later, the cafe is still open, making it one of the oldest continuously operating cafes in the city. But back then, it was something entirely new. Procopio began serving frozen desserts on a regular basis in elegant glass dishes, experimenting with flavors like fruit, chocolate, and vanilla, an ingredient that had only recently arrived in Europe from the Americas. His creations quickly became fashionable. The cafe attracted some of the greatest minds of the age, including Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Benjamin Franklin, who spent several years living in Paris. Little by little, ice cream stopped being just another dessert. It became part of city life. A visit to Café Procope wasn't simply about eating something sweet. It was about being seen. Much like today's famous cafes and fine restaurants, it became a gathering place for artists, philosophers, politicians, and the wealthy elite. Yet despite its growing popularity, one enormous obstacle remained. Ice, the man who sold winter. For centuries, ice cream had one unavoidable problem. It depended on ice, and ice was available only during the winter. Ironically, people wanted frozen desserts the most during the hottest months of the year, exactly when ice was hardest to find. That made ice cream an expensive luxury. Only the wealthy could afford ice houses large enough to store winter ice until summer. Even in Paris, rich families treated ice as a precious resource. For everyone else, ice cream was something they might enjoy only during festivals or very special occasions. Then one young American decided to challenge that reality. In the early 19th century, a 22-year-old Boston entrepreneur named Frederick Tudor came up with an idea that sounded completely ridiculous. He wanted to harvest huge blocks of ice from the frozen lakes of New England, pack them in sawdust, and ship them thousands of miles to tropical countries, first to Cuba and the Caribbean, then eventually to the rest of the world. Almost everyone laughed at him. Newspapers mocked the idea. Friends and relatives refused to invest. One magazine joked that his next business would probably be selling bottled air. His critics seemed to be right. In 1806, Tudor's first shipment of ice reached Martinique, but much of it had melted along the way. The merchants didn't even know what to do with it. No one wanted to buy it. The business collapsed. Tudor lost almost everything, and even ended up in debtor's prison. Most people would have given up. He didn't. After his release, Tudor went back to work. He experimented with better insulation, discovered that sawdust kept ice frozen far longer than expected, improved storage facilities, and redesigned the way ice was transported across oceans. At the same time, he had to convince customers that ice was actually useful. He taught restaurant owners how to store it. He encouraged merchants to sell it. And to spark public interest, he even handed out free ice cream and served chill drinks. Slowly, people began to understand what they had been missing. By the 1830s, Tudor ships were delivering ice as far away as India, Australia, China, and the Caribbean. The impossible idea had become a global business. Frederick Tudor eventually earned the nickname the Ice King. His success created the world's first international ice trade and made ice available to millions of ordinary people. Without realizing it, he also helped make ice cream affordable on a scale the world had never seen before. But every success carries unexpected consequences. As demand exploded, companies rushed to harvest more ice. Not everyone cared where it came from. Many cut corners. Some harvested ice from polluted rivers and lakes without any concern for sanitation. One of the tragic results was the deadly Chicago epidemic of 1858, when contaminated natural ice spread disease instead of relief. The disaster revealed a harsh truth. Natural ice could no longer meet the needs of a growing industrial world. A safer solution was desperately needed. And surprisingly, one of the biggest breakthroughs came not from a factory owner or an engineer, but from a woman working with a simple kitchen invention, the stolen invention. In 1843, an American inventor named Nancy Johnson patented a remarkable new machine. It was a hand-cranked ice cream maker with a rotating paddle, inside a metal container surrounded by ice and salt. The design was brilliantly simple. The salt lowered the freezing temperature of the ice, allowing the mixture to freeze faster, while the constantly turning paddle prevented large ice crystals from forming. The result was smoother, creamier ice cream that could be made in about 20 minutes instead of several hours. For the first time, homemade ice cream became practical for ordinary families. But Nancy Johnson never became rich from her invention. Soon after receiving her patent, she sold the rights for only $200. The patent was later purchased by William Young, who built a thriving business manufacturing ice cream makers. Johnson, meanwhile, received nothing more. Her story became one of many examples of talented women inventors whose ideas changed the world, while others earned the profits. Even so, her invention transformed the future of ice cream, making it became easier, faster, and far less expensive. By the middle of the 19th century, ice cream was no longer reserved for kings and aristocrats. It was becoming something ordinary families could actually enjoy. And just when it seemed the dessert had reached everyone, an unexpected rule created one of the world's most famous ice cream treats, the band that created a new dessert. Long before the waffle cone became famous at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, another American invention had already changed the way people enjoyed ice cream. By the late 1800s, soda fountains had become the social centers of many American cities. People gathered there to enjoy fizzy drinks mixed with fruit syrups and generous scoops of ice cream. For many young people, it was a place to meet friends and spend an afternoon. Then Sunday arrived. Across much of the United States, Sunday was treated as a day of rest. In many communities, entertainment was discouraged, and some local governments even banned or restricted the sale of carbonated drinks on Sundays. For soda fountain owners, that created a problem. Instead of closing their doors, they came up with a clever solution. They simply removed the carbonated water. What remained was a scoop of ice cream covered in sweet fruit syrup. A simple change. A completely new dessert. Before long, people began calling it the sundae, a name many historians believe was deliberately spelled differently from Sunday to avoid religious controversy. In some American cities, local laws even restricted or completely banned the sale of carbonated drinks on Sundays. For the owners of soda fountains, that was a serious problem. Their most popular drinks could no longer be served on one of the busiest days of the week. So they improvised. Instead of serving fizzy sodas, they simply skipped the carbonated water and served scoops of ice cream covered with sweet fruit syrup. The customers loved it. What began as a clever workaround soon became a dessert in its own right. People started calling it the sundae. Many historians believe the spelling was deliberately changed from Sunday to Sunday to avoid religious controversy, although the true origin of the name is still debated. One of the earliest documented sales of a sundae dates to 1892 in Ithaca, New York, but several other American cities insist the dessert was invented there instead. Like many famous foods, the exact birthplace of the sundae remains a mystery. Today, whether it's topped with chocolate sauce, whipped cream, nuts, or a cherry, the sundae has become one of the world's most beloved desserts. Ironically, it wasn't created because someone wanted to invent a new recipe. It was born simply because people found a creative way around an old rule, the accident that changed everything forever. Now let's move ahead to 1904. The place is the St. Louis World's Fair, one of the biggest events the world had ever seen. For 7 months, more than 20 million visitors streamed through its gates. Ice cream vendors can barely keep up with the crowds. Then, during the busiest part of the day, disaster strikes. One vendor runs out of paper cups. For most businesses, that would have meant the end of sales. But the vendor next door had an idea. His name was Ernest Hamwi, a Syrian immigrant selling thin, crispy waffle-like pastries. According to the most popular version of the story, he quickly rolled one of his pastries into the shape of a cone and suggested using it instead of a paper cup. It worked perfectly. Visitors loved the idea. Soon, people weren't just eating ice cream. They were eating the container, too. The waffle cone became an instant sensation. Did Ernest Hamwi really invent it? No one knows for certain. Several people later claim credit, and historians still debate who deserves the title. But one fact is beyond dispute. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair introduced the waffle cone to millions of people and turned it into one of the most iconic symbols of ice cream around the world. It was a perfect blend of cultures. Middle Eastern-style waffles, Europe's centuries-old tradition of frozen desserts, and an American World's Fair that brought them together before a global audience. As the way people ate ice cream was changing in America, another revolution was quietly taking place across the Atlantic. This time, the breakthrough wouldn't come from a chef. It would come from a scientist, Margaret Thatcher, and the air inside. In the late 1940s, a group of British food researchers began looking for ways to make ice cream production faster, cheaper, and more efficient. Among them was a young chemist named Margaret Roberts. Years later, the world would know her by a different name, Margaret Thatcher, the future Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Her research team discovered something surprisingly simple. By whipping more air into the ice cream mixture during churning, they could produce a larger volume using the same amount of ingredients. The extra air also made the ice cream lighter, softer, and easier to store and transport. For manufacturers, it was a game-changing discovery. For consumers, it changed the way ice cream tasted. This innovation paved the way for the rise of soft-serve ice cream, the creamy version now found in fast food restaurants, vending machines, amusement parks, and street kiosks around the world. Unlike traditional ice cream, soft serve contains less milk fat and much more air. That trapped air gives it silky texture and allows it to stay soft without becoming rock hard. It was another turning point in the story of ice cream. Production became cheaper, distribution became easier, and what had once been a luxury became affordable for millions more people. By the middle of the 20th century, ice cream had truly become a dessert for everyone. Ice cream behind the Iron Curtain. While Western countries relied on private businesses and fierce competition to shape the ice cream market, the Soviet Union took a completely different approach. There, ice cream wasn't just a popular snack. It became a small but unforgettable symbol of everyday Soviet life. In the 1930s, Anastas Mikoyan, the Soviet People's Commissar for the food industry, traveled to the United States to study modern food manufacturing. One product caught his attention in particular, ice cream. After returning home, he pushed for the creation of a large-scale Soviet ice cream industry. New factories opened across the country. Production increased rapidly. And for the first time, ordinary Soviet citizens could enjoy ice cream on a regular basis. Unlike many Western manufacturers, Soviet producers followed strict government standards. The rules specified exactly which ingredients could be used and how the final product should taste. One variety, known as plomber, became especially famous. Made with real dairy fat instead of vegetable substitutes, it earned a reputation for rich flavor and high quality. Because every factory followed the same recipe, a plomber bought in Moscow tasted almost identical to one purchased thousands of miles away. Visitors from abroad often mentioned Soviet ice cream in their travel journals, describing it as one of the country's unexpected pleasures. Another thing that surprised them was seeing people happily eating ice cream in the middle of winter. For Soviets, the season didn't matter. Ice cream was enjoyed all year long. After the Soviet Union collapsed, everything changed. Private companies entered the market, introducing countless new recipes and ingredients. Many products began using vegetable fats and cheaper alternatives that had rarely appeared in the original recipes. For many people who grew up during the Soviet era, the taste of classic plomber became something more than just a dessert. It became a memory. Even today, debates continue over whether Soviet ice cream really tasted better. The answer probably depends less on the recipe than on the memories attached to it. A $200 billion industry built on frozen water and sugar. Today, the global ice cream industry is worth around $200 billion every year, an economy larger than that of many countries. The United States, Australia, and New Zealand remain among the world's biggest ice cream lovers on a per-person basis. Meanwhile, China has become the world's largest market by total consumption, and demand continues to grow every year. The biggest manufacturers now produce billions of servings annually, selling ice cream in almost every corner of the globe. What was once a luxury enjoyed by emperors has become one of the world's most universal foods. Different cultures have also made it their own. Japan introduced the world to mochi ice cream, wrapping creamy ice cream inside soft rice dough. Italy continues to be famous for its rich and silky gelato, even though the version we know today was largely perfected during the 20th century. And innovation hasn't stopped. Today, supermarket freezers are filled with lactose-free, vegan, coconut, oat, and almond-based ice creams. Scientists and food companies continue experimenting with liquid nitrogen freezing, sugar-free recipes, probiotic ingredients, and entirely new textures and flavors. Ice cream keeps evolving, adapting to changing tastes and healthier lifestyles. Whether those healthier versions will ever replace the classics, only time will tell. The story of ice cream stretches across continents and centuries. It begins with mountain snow gathered for Chinese emperors. It passes through Arab marketplaces, Sicilian kitchens, Parisian cafes, American factories, and Soviet food plants before arriving in freezers all over the world. It's a story of curiosity, trade, science, culture, and sometimes unexpected mistakes. None of the people we've met, Emperor Taizong, Francesco Procopio, Frederick Tudor, Nancy Johnson, or the many others, could have imagined how far their ideas would travel. Each was simply trying to solve the challenges of their own time. Together, those small solutions transformed one of history's greatest luxuries into one of humanity's favorite desserts. The history of ice cream wasn't written by one inventor or one brilliant idea. It was built one discovery at a time. And that's not a bad legacy for something that once belonged only on an emperor's table.